So it's going to take a few minutes to set the YouTube link up, and then we'll start everything. Cool. So. Nice. Super nice to have everyone here. I'm just going to start off with a quick introduction of all of our speakers today, and really nice that you could be here, so hello. So my name's Frankie, and along with Kieran Cotter, I'm part of a collective called RE-PEAT. We are a youth-led collective working on collaborating, educating, and a process of reimagining, all to do with peatlands. We also have Deirdre Lane with us. So Deirdre, among many other endeavours, is the founder of Shamrock Spring, which is an empowering and advisory environmental NGO that focuses on local regenerative solutions. Ben Geary and Rosie Everett are part of an organisation called Wet Futures, which is an organisation that offers inter and transdisciplinary approaches to wetland heritage in the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and Ireland. And finally, we have Derek Gladwin with us, who is an author, an educator, and Derek is committed to exploring transformations in culture and society through environmental narrative and arts-based education. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to now share my screen, and let me see. 1 second. Yes. So here we are. So first of all, I want to just do a quick PEAT 101 for those of you that don't know what PEAT is. So PEAT is peat forms when you get a depression in the land and you get water filling up the land, and the local plant matter falls into the water, and when enough plant matter falls in, the oxygen level goes down and the acidity level goes up, and the plants aren't able to fully decompose. And what happens is, over periods of thousands of years, or hundreds to thousands of years, you get this buildup of semi-decomposed plant matter, and that basically, over a long period of time, creates a peatland. Some ecological facts about peatlands are that they are extremely good at flood protection. They are extremely efficient carbon stores. So believe it or not, they store 10 times the carbon as all the forests of the world combined, despite only taking up 3% of the planet's surface. They are also extremely niche habitats for biodiversity, and they stop floods and yeah, many other things. So they're a pretty amazing ecosystem. So on that front, I'm gonna pass you on to Kieran, who's gonna talk about peat from his perspective. So Kieran, please.
Thanks, Frankie. And just a quick thank you to everyone for tuning in. This is a big day for everyone in the RE-PEAT calendar. So, you know, it's just nice day to kind of raise awareness and kind of see what peatlands are all about. So what I'm going to talk about is the paradox between the familiar and the unknown. So this is essentially my perspective growing up in a peatland reliant community. I took the title from a literary review that Derek Gladwin did, and Derek is going to be speaking later on, so stay tuned for that. And I think it really hit, like when I read that, it really hit the nail on the head, that like I've been surrounded by these all my life, and you know, I was familiar with them, but at the same time I didn't really know the function or like how it all came about. But yeah, essentially my name is Kieran Cotter. I've been part of RE-PEAT since 2019, and while we still value our heritage of cutting turf, these landscapes are sort of being changed forever. I'm speaking to you from Knocknagashel in County Kerry, which is in the southwest of Ireland for all of our international listeners. But this day last year, I held a workshop in my local primary school for students to understand the value of the bogs, both culturally and ecologically. So I grew up around these places all my life. I have very fond memories of sitting in the trailer, just coming home with a big trailer of turf from the bog every summer. Even my name in Irish, which is Kieran, which refers to kind of term as a small sod of turf. Kier meaning dark and on meaning something small. If we just look at the painting that's in the slide here, this is done by a local artist, and this is what's familiar to people when they think of the bog. This painting is essentially a reflection of our cultural heritage and also the simple beauty of life in rural Ireland. However, I kind of feel this is a paradox for me, but also for a lot of people that don't understand exactly, a lot of people don't understand what the bog is. So we can view it as a fuel source for the community, which is important, especially for these rural communities. But we can also value them as wetlands to ecological wildlife that's in decline. I think we can all agree that it's a habitat for wildlife that's under threat. So when we think of a bog and we think of cutting and saving, as it's locally known as, a tradition, several members of the family pitch in, and it all kind of revolves around teamwork of the family, which is great. It's kind of what a lot of people think of when they remember the bog. The whole family pitching in, drinking tea and having sandwiches. So there's this real familiarity with the culture around the bogs, but also the kind of unknown of how it all became about and why they're important. Like my dad recalled seeing many wild birds when he was a child, such as the curlew. Since then, curlew especially has been in severe decline. So, from my perspective, as a young man that sees myself in this area in the future, I'm thinking, what is the future of this bog? Nowadays we can heat our homes from several different sources, which doesn't involve backbreaking work saving the turf and doesn't emit harmful greenhouse gases from our chimneys. So to kind of understand my perspective, it's a very sensitive one. It's kind of hard to explain. That's why it's a paradox. But this perspective, I feel, is one that is valued within the RE-PEAT group, because I'm essentially on the ground in these communities, seeing the just transition. And we talk about the peatland paradigm shift with RE-PEAT, which is essentially reimagining and kind of being more familiar with the unknown of what these bogs are all about. And I personally think that this shift in reimagining is more future-proof than continuously using the bog as a fuel source. In the future, I really want to teach young people about the cultural aspect of the bog, like I talked about, going there with your family. It was all kind of teamwork, bonding session. But I also want to save these landscapes for wildlife habitat, and that's how I feel it's more future-proof. So it's an interesting concept to kind of think about. So for now, I'm going to pass it on to Deirdre. She's going to talk about the woman of Kildare, the woman from Kildare. So if you'd like to talk about that a bit, Deirdre.
Will do. I'm honoured to have a Kerry man pass over to a Kildare woman, considering St. Brendan had a conversation with Brigid back in the day. He came back from his travels, having seen the world and all these monsters in the sea, and he was telling people about it. And she went, you know, they're creatures too, they're folk true. And she walked away and Brendan said, who was that? It's the woman of Kildare. So who was Brigid? So Brigid is a woman of contradictions. She's a woman of our time. She's a woman of all times. The fact that she was actually born in 451 makes you wonder, why are we still talking about this legend? So she was a goddess, but she was also a saint. So the difference is a goddess can sin, but a saint can't. So which would you rather be? So not only was she a goddess of nature, she was a goddess of healing and agriculture and smithing and the arts and fertility and beer, spring, the dawn, physicians, poetry, and martial arts. So a bit of a contradiction there. If you're the warlord goddess and martial arts and physicians, how does it actually work? So we're going to be exploring that today with the next page, please. So essentially the saints, the Christians took over our immortal Irish abbess, and she became known as Brigid of Ireland, one of our 3 patron saints. So basically, she founded a monastery, lots of monasteries, in fact, but the monastery we're talking about today is the one in Kildare. So Kil in Irish means church, and Dara is the oak tree. So the oak tree is actually a pioneer species of trees in Ireland and can survive fabulously well in the CO2 rises and falls in temperature changes, unlike the oak tree, which is already in trouble with the intensity of carbon dioxide. So she protected everyone. She was a wonderful little child, but her father didn't think so. So she was actually one of 3 sisters called Deirdre. So can you imagine in their household on Valentine's Day if the one card arrived with Brigid written on it? So basically her father at one point was so fed up of her. So a woman came to the house and she actually had apples for the family. And what did Brigid do? She took her father's apples, a bit like me, Nick, in this one tonight, and she gave it to the poor. Well, her father was furious. Her father also tried it on with Brigid, and he was not impressed when she said no. So he took her to the king, and he was trying to sell her to the king at the time. What did she do? Didn't she take his sword with all the jewels when she was out in the horse and cart waiting, as he was negotiating inside, and she sold it? So he came out and he was raging and he was about to beat her senseless. And the king said, listen, there's nothing you can do. She's brilliant at agriculture. Look at her. She's the king of sheep, the king of the boars. She makes fabulous beer. Leave her alone. We'll give her freedom. So the slave at that time was given her freedom, and that was fantastic. So what she did not long afterwards is she got 6 of her friends, and all 7 of them went to see the bishop and said, listen, we need to share these skills. We need to change ways and rules for everybody. So I'd like to have a monastery. And the bishop said, Jesus, Brigid, you're sound. Of course you can have a monastery. So all you need is the bit of land. And the bishop went off, drank the beer that she brought and the apples that she brought. And lo and behold, she had to go and see her friend, the king. So she went to the king anyhow. Next page, please. And the king had a conversation with her in Kildare. And this is the cathedral in Kildare where we were last night alone. Next slide, please. To say, okay, Brigid, you can have as much land as your cloak can cover. So what Brigid did was, being the queen of ale, she sat down and she had a beer. Now, beer is very important for sanitization and for health. And these 2 sisters are 5th generation beer brewers in Kildare itself. Now, Kildare is very interesting land and geography. And in fact, Brigid, not only was she the king or the queen of everything and goddess, she also had her own lake of beer. So the Boyle sisters were just sharing yesterday how important it was to have good water, failing that, good beer. So the microbes in beer, in fact, are less than the microbes in the water. So there were no toilets in that day. So that, you know, sanitary wasn't all that clean in different places. So the beer, in fact, would actually help you sanitize what you were drinking. So basically, beer is bred in a glass. So these 2 sisters still brew the beer in Kildare town, and they're known as gypsy brewers. So if you couldn't afford your own brewery, you'd befriend a brother in beer or a sister in beer, and they'd make the beer for you. So next page, please. So basically, you can still get the beer, and the Brigid's cloak story is the fascinating part. So the king turned around, he drank the beer. Thanks very much there, Brigid. I'll give you as much as your cloak can cover. So she was fighting for the beer, birds and the bees and nature. So she takes off the coat and she gets her friends and she sheared that king of the sheep and she made it out of wool is what I deduce, because there was no polyester around in those days, no microplastics. So she got the cloak with her friends and she went, whew, it covered all of the Curragh. So that's just one of the miracles that this wonderful goddess is behind on the Curragh. So next page, please. She built her monastery on the Curragh, and that's a vision that we just saw. So the Curragh is still home to these wonderful David Bowie-esque sheep here on the left. And this lamb was actually painted by a painter of art on the Curragh who painted the King of the Netherlands and the Queen of the Netherlands recently as well. Brigid was goddess of art and craft. So next page, please. One of the things that she did as goddess of the time was to change people's views of arts and crafts and the rights of makers. So the Kildare market is still going ahead today. And what Brigid did was she changed the craft makers' rights to be paid. So let's say you've knitted Kieran's Gansey there and you didn't get paid. You went to Brigid, she changed the rules at the time to say you're entitled to be paid for what you actually do. So in terms of sanitization of water to beer, we also have the sanitization of the goddess and what she actually accomplished at that time. So the church wanted to have somebody who's clean and holy and pious. So they reinvented our lovely goddess Brigid, Imbolc season that we're celebrating today, and her feast day was yesterday. And they merged the two values. So just like we have Brigid and her two sisters, the Brigid goddess deities in other countries as well. So there's a story I heard this week. She's actually half Portuguese and her head office is in Portugal. Her head is still out there in Portugal because apparently her mother was a Portuguese slave too. Who knows? We'll soon find out. So basically we had a merging of the two views, the Christian values and the pagan values that we had. And one of the obligations at the time was fire keeping. So Brigid had 17 virgins in the fire pit behind that cathedral that we just saw that tended to the fire. So don't forget, there were no fire lighters in those days. There were no matches. So if you were one of those virgins, there was nothing else to do either. There was no tinder. So they would sit and tend the fire and keep the fire lit. So girls and boys, keep it lit out there for nature as well. So one of the things Brigid created was the Brigid's cross, that we all know the reeds that are growing in wetlands are the very reeds that we make the cross from. But is it a cross or is it a solar toy? So it'll tell us this is the spring season, summer is coming around, autumn, etc. So basically it's a different way of viewing the tools and the crafts that they had in storytelling at the time. So next page, please. And again, it's the church, they found the solar cross and thought, ooh, this is quite handy. I know this story. So in terms of the healing goddess, they didn't have pharmacies at the time, but what she was as goddess of physicians and the owner of the king of all sheep is she had ways of working with what she had. So the Curragh is full of sheep today still as a commonage. The lanolin is used for the skin and ointments and breasts. If you saw breasts, for example, the mothers would use lanolin. The wool was super insulating for your houses as well. So if you got in wet, drenched wet on a spring evening, you're out there lambing your sheep, you want to put something warm on yourself. So the wool is very microbial, not friendly, and it's a very good way of keeping warm, as you can put any warm vessel on your head, on your gansies, your lovely woolen clothing on tonight, and feel how warm it is. Now, there's another study that they've done recently. People are sleeping less and having sleeping problems. They've shown now that if you sleep with a woolen pillow, it helps your sleep. So in those days, because she was goddess of the fighters and the mercenary soldiers as well, she protected the men. So how could you protect the men at that time? Again, she got her cloak, and even covering the men meant that they'd somewhere warm and dry to be under as they recovered with the lanolin on their cuts to make sure that they were getting better. So next slide, please. She was also goddess of leechcraft. So, you know, she knew a thing or two, our Brigid. So we're at springtime today. Imbolc, bulg meaning stomach, in the stomach, so of the sheep at the time, and she had the king ram, so I'm sure he was good at making lots of lambs. In the sheep's stomach, you had the milk. So it's a symbol for fertility as well. So very much the king of the realms was certainly something fertile to be talked about at the time. And the event of having milk in the sheep's stomach meant that you actually had something to eat as well. So 3 drops of spring lamb milk were very healing in other ways as well. So fantastic. She had the fertility rites going on. She had the milk now. So if you have milk, you can have the sheep to have the cheese from and the milk from, and it's wonderful. So basically, we're going to go to thinking about their fertility rites at the time. So if you have 3 sisters and you're all called Deirdre, I'm sure you had a great time. So we've just discovered as well that written down in history, Brigid shared her bed with a woman. Now, as we all know today, who's writing the story of Brigid? Was it the man who turned away her advances at the time? Was it her father? Or was she actually a lesbian? So we've also heard the story that Brigid, a woman came to her again, she was heavily pregnant, in a lot of pain, and she helped induce an abortion in that woman. So she saved the woman's life. So she had different healing powers that Brigid actually gave to her community, and she shared the information in her monasteries throughout the time. So we're talking 450. And we're still talking about her legend today and her legacy and all the wonderful actions that we share together to mind the earth. So the universal aspect and respect that she commanded then with the king, she could negotiate herself out of many, many situations. She traveled quite a lot for a lady of her time as well. And the innovative skills that she shared are something that we should treasure and help share ourselves these days as well. So next slide, please. This is something, I couldn't actually find Brigid's sock. I looked everywhere. You know, when you have an odd sock, you're trying to find the other one. I couldn't. But this one is from the 4th century. Look at those colors. Absolutely amazing. So basically, this sock survived. Look at the colors that they had. So Brigid would have had gorse at the time and lovely, lovely colors. So it's another way, if we have wool, we can keep wearing it for years. We don't have to have all those microplastics polluting our bodies, polluting the earth afterwards. So let's rethink about ways of working with wool. So next slide there, please. So she was the adored goddess of poetry and culture of learning. So the bards loved the stories that she was telling, and the traditional still survive. So last night, Mary O'Connor, you're watching there was people in Kildare walking and chanting and singing her songs. So she was a future seer and divination, and she could also have prophecy. So she had a way with words at the time that could convince people to continue the conversations and help other people at the time. Brigid was goddess of the smiths, and there's still some smiths living in Umaris, where the Peatland Park is located today. And I happen to know from a spirituality priest who went to Faughart in County Louth, he doesn't think she's from Louth, he thinks she's from Kildare. And I'm actually half Louth. So anyhow, I claim she's from Umaris, by the way. So as a smith, she's forging a new way forward. So next page, please. So like we all are today, how can we protect our wetlands? So her story just last night projected this on the Kildare Cathedral wall. So the legacy of a ninja goddess, Brigid, is live today, and it's in all of us here in the room. So I'd like us to think, is Misha Brigid? I am the Brigid. So that ninja nun up there is in every single one of us out there. So how can we help nature, our wetlands, restore the bogs, drink good beer, and help each other to do more? So next page, please. So Brigid helped so many people, and very quickly, Kill, as I said, is church. Dara is the oak, and that's where we have many, many Tubber Dara, Kilbreed, Kilkenny, all these Kildare places that you may be familiar with, especially around Leinster, especially around Kildare. Next page, please. So today, I'm calling on everyone who works with peat and wetlands to consider yourself as climate farmers going forward. They're pockets of wilderness. They're very shrinking assets that we have. The bogs that are bold are leaching greenhouse gas. How can we protect our bogs as much as Brigid protected us with her cloak, and keep all that carbon in the ground and keep the peat in the ground? So I'd like to invite anybody who works with peat to consider yourself as a climate farmer going forward. So just as Brigid's father was cruel and not very nice by all accounts, as Nelson Mandela, our dear friend, says, there can be no keener revelation of society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. The mother and baby's children scandal in Ireland and direct provision in Ireland bears testimony to what we should be considering now and minding our wetlands. So thank you everybody for joining us today for World Wetland Day. We have 2 amazing stories ahead of us now, so I'd love you to stay on, and I'd like to introduce you to Rosie and to Ben in Wet Futures.
Hi everyone. I don't quite know how we're going to follow that.
Rosie, would you like me to stop sharing and you can share your screen?
Presentation.
Okay.
Deirdre, that was brilliant. Thank you. Hopefully we can be just as entertaining, and is it going to work?
Well, while Rosie is I'll just get my range, as they say, while Rosie is there's the goddess herself. We're gonna take you in I must say, a slightly different direction, I think. Oh, there we go. Oh,
The statement of the year. Could everyone see my screen?
I can see it here, so I'm assuming everyone else can.
Grand.
Okay. That's gonna be a yes. That is an expression we've very much got used to over the last 12 months or so. So yes, so my name is Ben Geary. I work at University College Cork in Ireland. For the benefit of any international listeners here, of which there are at least one in the form of colleague Derek Gladwin over there, all the way from Canada. We're part of a project called Wet Futures that was mentioned briefly earlier. I'm not really going to say much about Wet Futures at the moment, but some of the work that we can talk about now kind of was developed through the Wet Futures project. And that project was funded by the Irish Heritage Council. Myself and Rosie, as you can see there, are both on Twitter. And I can see from the list of people, it's a great thing about these Zoom conferences. You know who's in the audience. So if anyone is out there wants to tweet away, then please absolutely feel free. There are our Twitter handles there, as you can see. Anyway, so yes, we're going to take you in a slightly different direction. Rosie, next slide, please.
Oh, technology failed. There you go. Sorry.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about. We've had 2 excellent introductions to, I suppose, what you might call the way the bog is deeply embedded in Irish culture in many different ways and in many different iterations. We're going to take, I suppose, a slightly more questioning approach to some of the representations of bogs, and this is partly what we've been doing through Wet Futures. And again, this is echoing some of Derek's work, and he's much more qualified to talk about some of this than we are. So this is very much a kind of a bit of a smorgasbord, if you like, of some of the connections and some of the work and thought that has developed as the project's gone on. We've just heard about Brigid, and I think the important thing here is the importance of language and representation and context, because everything, as archaeologists, we're archaeologists by background, always say context is absolutely everything. So we've heard one particular projection of Brigid, of course. If we look to kind of more historical sources, then we find a very different, I suppose, representation, particularly of gender in that period. So again, this is an excellent blog. You can see the title of the blog there, and the blogger Vox, to go by his handle there, who's a medieval historian. He talks about really the status of women in the period when St. Brigid was alive, and he particularly refers to the fact that the gender roles, of course, in the medieval period are very different to the gender roles we observe in the present day. And the next slide, please, Rosie.
Yeah, so hi.
Sorry.
Oh, Ben. Oh, no. You can talk if you like. But I
think that was me, but never mind. As you can see, we're extremely well prepared, ladies and gentlemen. It's a sign of all our presentations. We're a very polished outfit. As we've heard already, the bog is deeply embedded in Irish culture in all sorts of ways. We heard Kieran talk extremely eloquently about saving the turf, of course. I mean, that brings us round to, I suppose, different ways we might think about peatlands. And this is, I suppose, at the root of some of the issues that we've heard alluded to already. For many years, bogs were seen really as, I suppose, if you like, agricultural landscapes, in the sense that peat was long thought of as being fairly useless for much apart from drying and burning. So we see that, for example, in the language around the peat harvest. Of course, peat does grow very, very slowly, but when bogs are drained to be cut, it doesn't grow anymore. So again, the word harvest communicates that idea of sustainability, which of course, bogs do not possess. And of course, this lies behind, I suppose, the realization over the last, I suppose, really only 20 to 30 years that peat is better off left where it is in the ground. And when it is in the ground, as we've heard already, it provides many, if you like, services from water storage through to carbon sequestration. It also, as we'll see shortly, is extremely important for heritage as well. Next slide.
Yeah, so one of the things that Ben and I have recently become interested in, and actually it's come out of lockdown, so potentially a dare I say it, a positive that's come out of the last year or so, is it's given us the time to sort of sit and think about where our research as paleoecologists sits within the narrative of peatlands, and particularly in terms of the future of peatlands. And as part of that, we've sort of sat and thought about the language that we use to sort of disseminate what aspect of peatland heritage and paleo ecology we want to bring forward to the conversation about the future of peatlands. And actually what that sort of got us thinking about is whose narrative are we actually telling? Like, which aspect of the peatland history do we want to communicate in terms of moving forward? And actually what that allows us to do is bring in a whole range of different mediums for looking at communication and the language in which peatlands can be represented. So in the top right, I have a word cloud from the Crichton Centre for Peatland Science, and the terminology used is pretty much built into the science of rehabilitation. So we're looking at things like carbon capture and sinkholes and restoration and sort of the ecology that's associated with these peatlands, so sphagnum and sort of the natural landscapes that we often, depict within climate science and peatland science. But moving back towards sort of the work that Ben and I do, the word cloud in the bottom right hand corner is an output from a heritage session that we ran pre lockdown with one of our colleagues, Dr. Kim Davis. And as you can see, the language that people associate with these peatlands is very different to that of the climate scientists. We're all talking about the same thing. We're all talking about peatlands, but it's about the narrative and the perception that changes the language in which people use. And this language doesn't necessarily have to be words themselves. If we look at paintings such as the very, very well known Paul Henry landscapes of the early 20th, mid 20th century, even if you don't know his name in Ireland, his works are infamous in terms of peatland art. And just the image that something like that evokes is so natural to what we understand of turf cutting in Ireland. We've got the turf sacks with a background to the natural landscape that these peatlands sit in. So in terms of the narrative that something like this shows is very different to the scientific language used in terms of peatland restoration, or the more historic language that we use when we talk about peatland heritage and peatland cultural heritage. And actually, the way in which language is used and the perception of peatlands can really change the angle in which people talk about peatlands. So if we look to the picture on the right, we have the bogmen, the bogmen themselves, the people who cut turf, talked about, very much in the forefront of the right to cut turf, either on an industrial scale or on a local scale, because these are the men who have cut turf historically, and it's part of their culture, and it's part of the language of their everyday lives. So actually, it's a different aspect of the narrative when we talk about peatlands, and I think we have to remember that as we move forward in terms of peatland restoration. Ben, sorry.
Okay, thank you, Rosie. Moving on from that, you mentioned the peat harvest earlier. There's also another, I suppose, unintentional harvest that we get from peatlands, and that's something that's particularly of interest to ourselves as archaeologists and paleoecologists. There's what we call a trigger warning here, because there's a picture of a bog body. I know it's sometimes said everyone loves bog bodies, but just to say, if you're anyway upset or disturbed by images of human remains, then look away now. Rosie, click please. So again, I'm sure this is kind of, in many ways, I'm going to use the word iconic. I suppose it's an iconic archaeological discovery from an Irish peatland. This is Cloney Cavern Man, a later prehistoric bog body. Again, if you've been to the museum in Dublin, you'll have seen the bog body exhibition, I'm sure. It's a fantastic exhibition. And really, I suppose bog bodies will be a find that we very strongly associate with Irish peatlands. They're actually an extremely rare find in terms of proportion of material we do discover. There's something else we would note here, that this body is partial because it was discovered, it was basically partially destroyed by the peat extraction machinery. So it's the great irony of, if you like, peatland archaeology, that the only reason we discover so much archaeology in Irish bogs, and other bogs in Europe for that matter, is because of drainage and peat extraction. In many ways, that's unwelcome. As archaeologists, we actually don't look to dig sites up, we look to keep them in the ground. But anyway, this brings us on basically. Next slide, please, Rosie. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Some more images. We could spend the whole evening looking at images of beautiful organic archaeology, because, of course, in Irish bogs, this is what we have in bogs generally, as we've heard already, where we have these low oxygen saturated conditions. We have the potential for archaeological preservation that we don't see really on any other landscapes on Earth, apart from one or two. And these are just a few shots here. Most typically, we talk about some of the trackways, the wooden structures that were built out into or across the peatlands, and they're of many different ages and many different sizes and shapes. Again, this is just a selection. In the middle there at the top, we have bog butter, which would again be a find I'm sure people will be familiar with. And some of my favourite finds I've thrown in there. And on the left there, we have the so-called Palace Boy Vestal. That's an Iron Age wooden trough or a vessel. And down at the bottom right there, you can see that unusual shape of wood. That's a later prehistoric wooden anthropomorphic figurine, of which there are a number of those in Irish bogs. They're actually they seem to have been deliberately deposited, and they're often linked to the deposition of humans in the form of bog bodies, but that's a completely different talk. I'm going at an angle. Next slide, please, Rosie. But where this brings us is back to where we kind of were talking about earlier on, and that is really the representation of peats and peatlands and bogs in Irish literature. And again, just to be very clear, as we've said already, myself and Rosie are by no means cultural or literary theorists, but as Rosie said, we kind of drifted a little bit into this during the summer, and we particularly became interested in Seamus Heaney's poetry, and again, I'm sure he needs absolutely no introduction. But what we were interested in is the way we can contrast some of Heaney's work and thought with, if you like, the reality, in inverted commas, of peatlands and Irish peatlands in the present day, and particularly with reference to the archaeological record. So we have an irony in that Heaney uses peat cutting and digging as you can see in our quote in a recent paper, as a real potent metaphor of creativity and identity. But in reality, it's the agent of destruction of much peatland archaeology, as we've seen already. And in fact, you can see from that graphic, we know from the Bord na Móna peatlands, there's around about 4,000 archaeological sites as of 2013. Less than 10% of those have been excavated. And as you can see from that graphic, almost all of them will be destroyed. Very, very few will be preserved in situ. So you can see how we have a contrast between some of these representations in these kind of iconic poetry. Heaney tells us the wet century is bottomless. Well, it's a metaphor, but the wet century is certainly not bottomless. And we're finding that as we cut down through the peat layers and destroy archaeology and destroy peat. Next slide, please, Rosie.
So bringing this back around to sort of the discussion on language and the way in which archaeology and peatlands and looking at the gendered landscape goes beyond sort of Seamus Heaney's poetry. I'm sure Derek will speak much better about this later, but the whole use of language and the discussion of how we use it to depict different aspects of peatland is really at the forefront of eco-criticism and examining gender within different sources of literature and non-fiction. And And that's something that we're really interested in and something that we're really keen to develop, particularly in looking at ways in which that we can use language to move beyond sort of the traditional narratives and tropes of peatlands and peatland archaeology, and sort of the groundwork that the poetry of Seamus Heaney has sort of brought in for those sort of discussions. And a really fantastic example of sort of looking at not just cultural heritage in terms of the archaeology, but cultural heritage of like language. Macon Magan's different exploration of the different words for peat is a really nice example. Even though this book, his famous book on 32 words for field, you know, it sort of explores the historical link between language and a landscape and how that can maintain that relationship as we move forward, you know, in terms of how we can use those words within peatland rehabilitation. Within the UK, Rob McFarlane, for example, he's explored this within Scottish peatlands as well. So it's clearly a sort of a uniform heritage aspect of these landscapes. Ben, I think you're on mute.
I'm on mute. Apologize. Again, that's been a common theme of this year is I think you're on mute and me talking to my computer with that happening. Apologies for that. So really just to tie things up, there's been a number of voices, if you like, in this presentation, some of whom we've kind of provided kind of names, certainly the influence of Derek himself, who's been a colleague for a couple of years, and other people in here as well, and particularly my colleague, Maureen O'Connor. Myself and Maureen have a paper coming out shortly, and I've taken the liberty of pulling a quote out of that paper. And we say this, and again, this is really echoing what other people have written, both in the world of literature and science, the environmental humanities. There's a pressing need to radically reorient national attitudes towards these landscapes, that's peatlands, requiring a multidisciplinary approach that marries the relevant science with a cultural analysis, offering ways of valuing the bog historically and aesthetically that do not enforce a masculine instrumentalist relationship with the natural. That's something we've not really delved into, and it's something that I'm sure Derek will return to. So I think at that stage, I think we've probably gone on long enough. I think that's our last slide, Rosie. As you can tell, we're so well prepared. I think if you click it, thank you very much. Thank you for listening. Hopefully this has been of some interest. Again, we'll attempt to answer any questions, and we'll hand you back now to Frankie and RE-PEAT. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody.
And we're back. I'm going to pass straight on to Derek. So, to you, Derek.
Well, hello, everyone. It's good seeing everyone here today on World Peatland Day. And if I recall, last year at this time, RE-PEAT did this 24-hour marathon of peatland educational curriculum. I think it was a year ago this time, if I'm not recall. But anyway, I was part of that process. I think Ben and Rosie were as well, I believe. Maybe Deirdre, I think maybe many of us were. So it's great to be back this year and talking about peatlands. I'm an educator at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, and I have a background in arts education as well as peatland education. So some part of my conversation today, really probably most of it, is really rooted in culture more than the physical topographies of the bog. I'm also kind of functioning here as somewhat of a discussant, responding to everyone's contributions today. And I, appreciate the batons being handed off, but of course, with the small amount of time that I have, I obviously can't dive too much into too many of these subjects. But I want to provide a little bit of a conclusion here and bring everyone back together in order to kind of lead us into the Q&A, so that we're meeting time. So before I begin with sort of questions for the group, I just wanted to follow up on some of these points made by Frankie and Kieran and Deirdre and Rosie and Ben. And then I might touch a little bit just on the link between bogs and how they become gendered spaces that Ben and Rosie gave a great introduction to. So Kieran's perspective is really valuable because it provides a lived experience of this of peatlands, and he explores the known and the unknown and sort of the complicated liminal spaces that bogs represent. As he points out, they are cultural, ecological, and historical, while they are also mysterious and uncanny topographies. And I think this is why they sort of remain so compelling, and why perhaps many of us have tuned into this talk today, and why we revisit peatlands. And I've seen some comments in the chat about Bogbodies being kind of introduced for the first time for some participants. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of the interesting aspects of what come out of peatlands and the culture and the history that are involved. So they're really rich spaces to explore, and many of us are doing that today in sort of a quick overview. And we still need to speak about bogs and, of course, how they serve as transitionary spaces in our cultural and ecological efforts to reconsider our relationship to them. Ultimately, they are relational spaces from my perspective, and we have these human and non-human relationships with peatlands. So my question for Kieran, and this is just, I'm going to throw every participant sort of a question that I kind of came up with as I went along, and we can maybe deal with this in the Q&A. We don't have to, but I sort of have a question for Kieran to consider in a little bit. How has your perspective changed about bogs from your experience as a youth and to you now as an adult? You spoke a little bit about that, but that lived experience you had as a youth, how has that shifted now? And maybe what are some of those shifts that have occurred? Deirdre's overview of St. Brigid, Brigid, pulls in some of the historical elements on sort of the back-to-back days of February 1st and February 2nd, which, if I'm not mistaken, is St. Brigid Day and World Peatland Day. So they're interesting, like very closely connected, if I'm not getting that incorrect. Maybe I am, but that, from my understanding, that's how it is. I appreciated Deirdre's storytelling presentation. It was really compelling. I was enthralled. Everyone else was enthralled. So thank you for that. It really gave us a different type of ways of exploring some of this history. And what a life she lived: scientist, historian, ecologist, martial artist. Did I hear that correctly? Martial artist, and so many other talents. So pretty remarkable. So my question for Deirdre to consider sort of in the Q&A, are there any sort of sustainability issues with using the bog reeds for the St. Brigid cross? I was curious about that. Like, do they still use the bog reeds when making the cross? Or, as you said, the solar item, however you want to describe it, or do they sort of make these out of different materials today? So that's something to consider, maybe talking about in a bit. And then Ben and Rosie's explanation through their work in wetland futures, which is, of course, more familiar with me as sort of colleagues and more aligned with some of the work that I've done over the years, really underscores different representations of gender, but how we think about these things in historical, archaeological, physical, material kinds of ways, and how they intersect. And that's always a rich and valuable place to excavate. No pun intended there, archaeologist pun, for those inclined to appreciate that. So my question for Ben and Rosie in the sort of the Q&A, when speaking about narrating peatlands, which I think is a really great way to describe that process. How do we narrate peatlands, which is really what we're all doing today. I mean, Deirdre did a fantastic job of narrating them through storytelling tradition, and Kieran did it through a lived experience perspective, and Ben and Rosie gave us a little bit more of an archaeological, but also some more of an academic perspective. So when we're narrating peatlands, how might you suggest we narrate peatlands as social or political discourses? So, for example, we see examples of this through ecological perspectives on the one hand, but also through land rights perspectives on the other, right? Very different kinds of ways of viewing these things. And how do we kind of think about narrating peatlands in contested spaces, right? In this case, contested narratives. So it looks like I have about 5 more minutes. So I think what I'm going to do is just follow up a little bit on sort of the gendered boglands that Rosie and Ben talked about. There's an edited collection published back in 2003 called Theorizing Ireland. And in it, Claire Connolly recognized that contemporary work by women writers, critics, painters, and sculptors turn again and again to the interrelation between body and land, seeking to make sense, perhaps, of the embodied nature of citizenship and subjecthood. So I guess the question that I have for us moving forward are, who are the citizens of Bogland, and how is this citizenship reconceived over time? I think this is the project that we're all kind of taking up right now in this discussion. And I talked about those relational aspects about the non-human and the human between peatlands and humans, but then of course other non-humans that are in organisms that are interacting with peatland. And how is this citizenship reconceived? We see historical threads of this. How do we think of this as the future? So in terms of the idea of gender, and coming back to Claire Connolly's point, we see this in many examples of literature, art, and culture, which is why I oftentimes turn to these as really artifacts to excavate in order to get more knowledge in these areas. And perhaps one resonant example, other than, of course, Haney, which if there's some time I may talk about, but I may not get to it, is Marina Carr's play By the Bog of Cats. I don't know if how many of us have seen this play. It came out in the 90s. It's been restaged a few different times in North America and Ireland over the last 20 years. But anyway, in the play, Carr focuses on a recurring theme of land and gender, really part of the larger narrative of land and gender, that land-gender relationship, and Irish nationalism and other aspects of Irish political history, in order to subvert and ultimately reclaim the narrative. Speaking of narratives of peatlands, there's an attempt here to reclaim this narrative of peatland. And so the bog in this play functions as a space that has been gendered, particularly as a space that holds historical value, that remains subdued and controlled by patriarchy. And of course, we know there's significant links with patriarchal traditions and thought, and how we reconceive sustainability and an ecological balance in the current moment. So these things are interrelated. So Carr reconsiders this relationship valuable to explore in the contemporary circumstances. And as post-colonial theorist Anne McClintock said back in this similar time that Carr wrote this play, women are typically construed as the symbolic bearers of the nation, but are denied any direct relation to national agency. So these contemporary political and social circumstances that I'm talking about here, but we all in part have been talking about, are important to consider in order to avoid the historic tendency to recast nationalist discourses as they directly relate to peatlands in Ireland that appropriate gender for male hegemony and other types of hegemony. So I think what I'll do is I'll conclude now. We'll leave Haney on the shelf since he's a little bit more known to many of us, and I'll just close by saying I think the discussions by Frankie and Kieran and Deirdre and Ben and Rosie, we can see how bogs offer this rich cultural and ecological tapestry that remain fundamental to not only Irish history, but also, if we can preserve them or protect them, to our Irish futures. Or as Deirdre asked us to do, how do we become climate farmers, right? Indeed, how do we culturally farm peatlands in consideration of, existential threats like climate change? So part of this work is how we perceive bogs. And this is, again, a thread and a theme we've heard throughout the last hour. As the sustainability author Fritjof Capra explained, the real ecological crisis is one of perception. Perception is the major shifting point. I would also add that the environmental crisis is not only one of perception. It is, I agree with that, but it's also one of education and application. So many of us that are attending today are part of that process of education. So I think we hope that today was a way to reconceive of bogs, to reconceive boglands as valuable spaces, and the ways in which we can educate others and ourselves about the importance of our wetland futures. So I guess at this point, because we're about at the 5 till mark, I'll open this up to the questions and discussions, and perhaps we can start, if any of the questions I threw out to any of the presenters, you're itching to answer one of those questions, you can start with that just to get us going, but we don't have to do that. So that's just a thought. and I will close it out and hand it back to our wonderful moderator, Frankie.
Nice, thank you, Derek. So I've had a little change of thought. We have 5 minutes left, and we were going to have like 1 or 2 questions, but maybe that's also we can still do that. But maybe people would also like to stay a little bit longer. But this is an optional part. In any case, I think what we'll do is we'll round it off at 10, and then we will have a poem by Deirdre and some more questions. But we will probably finish the recording so you can ask questions without being recorded. So yeah, thank you everyone. And it was amazing to see so many people here. And it's World Wetlands Day, so World Peatlands Day is coming up. We will have another crazy peat fest, don't worry. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to all the speakers. And yeah, also one more thing, if anyone is interested in giving a donation to RE-PEAT, specifically, we do have a crowdfunder going on at the moment. And yeah, so I think we can now go on to the questions. Yeah. So I'm gonna go, who would, if you put your questions in the chat, then speakers.
Can I just, sorry, can I step in? Is that all right? Am I over speaking? Sorry. I just wanted to